Welcome to this. Welcome everybody. I'm Andy Pickett. I'm the acting chair of the Footways and Cycle Track Management Group, and I'm very pleased to be hosting this webinar. We've got some very interesting talks coming up from a number of people on the theme of rural and suburban cycle networks, which I think is a very important and perhaps neglected topic. We've got Adrian Lord from PGA, Will Clark talking about solar eye, and we've got Sustrans, Ed Plowden, and Marcus Challoner from the Plowden River Trust. So I'm very pleased to introduce her lately. Before we do so, I'd like to tell you a bit about the Footways and Cycle Track Management Group, which is the group that I'm representing today. So if we could move on, please. So the key aspect to what we do, I think, is summed up in this statement, which is in the recent gear change vision and local transport note 121, which deals with the design of cycle infrastructure, which is about maintaining the route after it's built. And that's really the space that the Footways and Cycle Track Management Group operates in. If you could move on to the next slide. I mean, this is, we are a group that represents local authorities and other interested organisations dealing with maintenance and operation of walking and cycling networks. And we have a number of aims and objectives from our terms of reference, which is about championing good practice, promoting research and developing standards and guidance primarily for highway authority practitioners dealing with the maintenance and operation of walking and cycling infrastructure. We move on to the next slide, please. We develop guidance and carry out research in a number of areas around the serviceability and condition assessment of walking and cycling infrastructure, looking at the design and the maintenance techniques, and we also look at around the developing technology and innovations in this area, and we look at how the infrastructure is used and how we can best meet the needs of users. And we've been operating first as the Footways group, and then we widened our scope to include cycling as well. And so I've just listed the historic work that we've done, and if we could move on to the next slide. There's been some recent projects we've been involved in, all of which have been referenced in the recent guidance LTN 1208 and the gear change vision around the design of the surface of walking and cycling infrastructure, how we deal with risk-based maintenance management, and specifically for cycling, looking at serviceability and the way that conditioners assessment for cycleways. We're also working on winter surface guidance with another group that specifically deals with winter service. And we've got a number of projects that we've got planned. Now, these are all dependent on whether we can get funding to carry out some of these. Some of those will happen anyway, and I'll pick out a few of those that I think of particular interest. We're looking at providing guidance to inspectors in assessing risks to cyclists when they're looking at defects. We're looking at the impact of street trees on footways and how we deal with those. We're looking at the way that we assess condition of footways and cycleway networks. We're interested in looking at the reinstatement standards for utility works in cycle infrastructure. And
30 seconds, Andy, please. Yeah.
Okay, and then we're also doing some work looking at how maintenance of the temporary walking and cycling infrastructure that's been introduced on the back of COVID should be dealt with. There's some further information on the CIHT website about the Footways and Cycle Track Management Group now. That's just been moved over to there from their old site, so it's yet to be, the content is yet to be fully loaded over to there, but that, if you watch that space, that will give more information, and I'd be happy to take emails from people if you want further information on the work of the FCMG. So without further ado, if I could hand you over to Ed now, who's from Sustrans, who's going to talk about the work they're doing on their networks. Thank you, Ed.
Morning, everyone. Next slide, please. So my name's Ed Plowden. I'm the Director of Paths for Everyone for Sustrans. I'm going to whiz through just 4 or 5 introductory slides about Sustrans. Next slide, please, and then talk about a little bit more about the subject today. So as many of you know, the National Cycle Network is one of our 2 strategic priorities. The other is livable cities and towns, which obviously is not relevant to today. The NCN is a is Paths for Everyone, connecting cities, towns and countryside. We're the custodian of the National Cycle Network, working collaboratively with landowners because we only actually own about 3% of the network. And it's cared for by multiple networks and over 3,000 volunteers. That is the National Cycle Network as of 2018. We did a very significant comprehensive audit of it, and we found that actually 46% of it was poor or very poor, mostly on-road stuff because it was heavily weighted towards safety and on-road. 67% was on-road. Next slide, please. So our 20-year vision was to try and improve the situation and make the network safer and more accessible for everyone and take every mile to good or very good standard. We want to take more miles off-road. We're in the process of developing and rolling out network development plans, and we're also de-designating parts of the network that can't be improved. Next slide, please. So actually we did that. You may have seen that back in July. We reclassified a lot of red lines on this map and reduced the network from 16,000 to 12,000 miles. Most of that was on-road sections, and you'll see that's left us with about 2/3 rural, much of which is on-road, and about 1/3 urban, much of which is off-road. So what's the opportunity here? Well, we know that non-metropolitan districts and rural districts account for a disproportionate amount of transport carbon emissions, and many rural, like urban miles, journeys are less than 5 miles, and many of them are multimodal, so people may be connecting to longer distance motorized transport. And the key question is, I've forgotten what the key question is, back please. Can we transform this with everyday journeys by bicycle? That's a key question for the webinar that follows. And CREDS felt, that's the University of Leeds, Energy Demand Landscape, felt that e-bikes particularly have the capacity to cut our carbon dioxide emissions. City dwellers, because they have already lots of low carbon transport options, have less opportunity than actually using e-bikes in a rural and suburban settings. And their recommendations is that e-bikes, you'll see the red line there, should have a place within the hierarchy of transport provision, which is what Scotland have done. Improve infrastructure, have a strategic national cycle network. Well, there's a surprise. And also you do road space reallocation using tactical ruralism. And the propensity cycle tool agrees with that. You'll see we're not doing terribly well, particularly if we look at a county level cycling to work in 2011, but e-bikes have the opportunity to absolutely transform that and get us up to really quite significant levels, according to propensity cycle tool. Next slide, please. So the key question is, for Sustrans in particular, does the propensity to cycle tool give us a network, or does it give us a series of individual routes? Because I feel it's quite heavily weighted to origins and destinations. Next slide, please. Gear change is also quite an urban thing. So it talks about everyday shorter journeys, towns and cities, and closing roads to through traffic, etc. Next slide, please. And the tactical ruralism, we're seeing a bit of bike clash recently. That's in towns and cities where we've got a very dense road network. Imagine what we might see if we tried to do this in rural settings. So there's a challenge for us. Next slide, please. And actually, Sustrans, when I look at our image library, falls into a similar sort of trap. You know, on the left, you've got urban journeys, very much utility, focusing on getting to work, whereas the rural journeys on the right tend to be much more days out with the family or cycle touring or accessing the countryside, not necessarily utility journeys. Next slide, please. So one of our proposals is that anything that remains on road should be on a quiet lane. And so you'll see various different treatments here. The one on the left, I hasten to add, is not DFT approved, but it is a long way from London, so I think they're going to get away from it. The one in the middle is obviously a very quiet lane. Is that going to be direct enough? On the right, you'll see another signs only solution, but any of these going to be enough to traffic calm parts of the national cycle work. On the bottom right there, that's actually a stretch of network we've removed. That's a 60-mile-an-hour road with overtaking of vehicles. We didn't feel it was suitable and we didn't feel it could be calmed. So will some of these routes ever be safe or direct enough is another key question for us in our discussion. Next slide, please. And again, if we're going off-road, will these be direct and convenient enough? On the left, you've got the Bristol-Bath Railway Path. You'll see that the direct route is about 70% shorter than the longer route, but we have evidence that people will go literally the extra mile to go onto the much more quality path. The one in the middle is on the other side of Bristol. It's the Festival Way. That was greenfield development. It's quite direct. You'll see the red, the yellow and the green routes all more or less converge. And what one of the things I believe is that by doing greenfield, what you might call greenfield development, rather than trying to retrofit roads, it might be actually cheaper and easier. On the right, you'll see there's a canal and also ex-railways. The transformation they had in the 19th century of our social landscape means that they do connect a lot of cities and towns. But as we know on the bottom right, there's a lot of very difficult barriers. So will that convenience be there? Next slide, please. So one of our key questions for ourselves and for this group is how do we prioritize and how do we develop those networks? So are we going to be prioritizing between rural or urban areas, which is what Gear Change seems to be saying? Are we going to be connecting the urban and the rural suburban, which is possibly more that wider map where you see Edinburgh at the bottom there would be actually connecting some of the feeder towns. On the right, you'll see in Buckinghamshire, if you draw a 5-mile radius, which is eminently cyclable, let alone by e-bike, around a number of the market towns, you've got really quite a good overlapping mesh density there. And of course, the role of e-bikes might mean that some of those other settlements you can see on that map might be connected too. So that's how to prioritize what sort of network we do. Next slide, please. We've been also thinking about how we then prioritize within our network, our master planning, our network development. So we're thinking about those different scoring criterias, some which are very much can be GIS and quantitative, and some of which are much more qualitative. One of the really important ones there is support, a qualitative assessment of just how easy and what the political will is going to be in that area. So those are various questions for us. I guess the last question, next slide, please, is actually, do we reprioritize altogether? So if we look at no presentation like this can get away without mentioning Denmark and Holland. They're now investing heavily in inter-urban networks. And these are both slide images from Denmark and Holland. And maybe our 27 billion that we're going to be spending on a road investment strategy could actually be either doing parallel roads, as you see on the left, or really good quality inter-urban and connecting the suburbs with the city networks, as in Denmark and Holland. So that's maybe a political decision, and I think we may be thinking about the prioritization I've already talked about instead. Of course, 27 billion is only going to increase the convenience and use of cars. So that's a bit of a danger for us all. Thank you very much. That's me done.
Thank you, Ed. But now we've got Adrian Lord, who's going to talk about, actually, what are you going to talk about?
Suburban extensions and rural areas as well.
Okay, well, I look forward to hearing about that then. I'm sure there'll be some interesting questions that will come out of that.
That's great. Can I have the next slide, please? And the next. So, as Ed said, gear change sets up a kind of challenge for a step change in cycling and walking in the coming years. But are we actually doing those door-to-door journeys? Because most people make their decision about how they're going to make a journey the minute they step out of their front door. And quite often that suburban element is somewhat lacking. Next slide, please. So this is Preston, and an example of we have got quite good now at doing town and city centre treatments. And one of the kind of good things that's happened out of COVID is that some of these smaller towns and neighbourhood centres have seen a bit of an uplift in trade, or at least they haven't suffered as badly as some of these city centre areas. So there is this kind of move towards an opportunity towards reviving some of these kind of neighbourhood centres and smaller towns, as people are not travelling into cities so much. So the opportunity is there at this moment when people are changing their travel behaviour. Next, please. So what are we talking about in these sort of areas? What sort of infrastructure? And it's mainly about reducing the speed and volume of traffic and introducing placemaking features. So it's less about some of the segregated infrastructure that we see along big radial routes and in the central areas. Next slide, please. And Manuel for Street said, within residential areas, cyclists should generally be accommodated in the carriageway, and there shouldn't be any need for dedicated infrastructure. Next slide, please. But are we getting it right in new development? So this is what the government set out 2 years ago. We want to see vibrant mixed-use communities where people can live, work and play for generations to come. Each will be holistically planned, self-sustaining and characterful. And you would think that walking and cycling would be right at the centre of that, given what we've been doing in lots of our town and city centres to revive them. But this report, which was published by Transport for New Homes, a group of authors, had looked at 20 of the most significant developments around England, and not one of them has got a cycle network, a comprehensive cycle network. Many of them are being sold on the basis that they're close to the strategic network. They may have large areas of housing, but they don't necessarily have all of the other things that make for a good place. So all of the other functions of employment and retail and so on and so forth. So we are creating lots of fairly car-dependent developments. Next slide, please. And this is what quite a lot of them look like. So, would you actually want to walk and cycle on there? Is that really designed with sustainability and walking and cycling in mind? Next slide. And these are many of them supposed to be garden villages or garden settlements, and yet try and spot the garden. It's some of these places just look like big car parks, and we know that perhaps some of the reason for this is that if these streets are adoptable by local authorities, they don't necessarily have the revenue budget to maintain things. But clearly, this kind of atmosphere is not conducive to walking and cycling, and even the geometry of the roads, you can see that really flared junction on what is a residential street. We're not even getting the basics right. Next slide, please. But there are, of course, settlements where we are getting it right, and this the one on the left there is Poundbury, active frontage, so it's a pleasant street to walk down. You can nosy in people's gardens and front rooms. You know, there are other places where you've got these kind of off-road greenways that connect directly into the settlement. So there are many places where we are getting it right. Next slide, please. And some of the features that mean that these places are more successful. Obviously, footways alongside the carriageway. You'd think that would be a basic element, but again, quite often missing on some new development still. But also interesting places between the buildings. So it may be alleys and courtyards, public squares and so on. And places where people can gather within the centre of the development. And the other thing which we observed with some of these areas is that they're not really well connected into existing networks. And so quite often they ignore the existing network of public footpaths and bridleways that are nearby. And one thing that is important, and you see this in North Cambridge and in North Stowe, the sort of urban extension, public transport is right at the heart of that. So it's well connected, and there is a new station for North Cambridge with a big cycle parking area, and it does very much look like Mini Holland, the sort of vision. So we can do it, and there are examples around the country, but quite often we are not doing it. Next slide, please. And this is just a couple of examples. This is Malmo in Switzerland. If any of you watch the bridge, those two, the slide in the middle and the one on the bottom left, that's where Saga Norén lives. So Malmo in Sweden, sorry. The top left picture is Groningen in the Netherlands, and again, the houses there front directly onto the cycle and walking route, and the cars go in around the back. Top right is Bristol. Again, you've got good cycling and walking route along the waterfront with the housing fronting onto it, and the cars going around the back. And similar on a section of Quiet Way 1, I think in Deptford there. So, you know, there are places where we do get it right. Next slide. And this is my hometown, and you can see there on top right what it looked like in the 1970s. And interestingly, if you look at the upper Calder Valley on the propensity to cycle tool, it scores really badly. It's a hilly area. There isn't much evidence of cycle and walking commuting, but that's because a lot of the trips are linked trips, so people cycle and walk to the station. But more importantly, a lot of the cycling and walking activity that takes place locally is for leisure and exercise purposes, which doesn't, of course, show up in propensity to cycle. So we don't always pick up on some of the reasons why people are traveling in rural areas and smaller towns, which are equally important. And as Ed said, I think some of the toolkit that we've got at the moment scores quite badly on how it treats sort of rural and suburban areas, and it doesn't necessarily lead you towards places and the sort of low traffic neighborhood solutions. Next slide, please. So what are low traffic neighborhoods? It's really applying those same principles that we use in central areas to look at local suburban centres and residential areas. So it's traditional traffic calming and traffic management techniques to remove some of the through traffic and to slow traffic down. And quite often that's to link to local schools, but also shopping parades, and more recently to provide safe outdoor space in COVID-19. Next slide. Planning LTNs. Again, it's important to work out where people are going, so that you know which streets are the ones that are affected by through traffic, and that can be done using data, and there's a lot of data around now, but also with the impact of local knowledge. And it's important to think about what will happen when you put the LTN in. And so have you dealt with all the emergency services, all the servicing for refuse collection and so on? Will it work still? And then who will look after it? So Andy's point about maintenance. And there are places where local groups have adopted some of the planting so that it's not then a burden to the local authority. Next slide. So the idea has been around for a long time. So in the 1980s, we had home zones, and then in the 1990s, 2000s, next slide, we started to put them in the UK. Sorry, next slide. So there was a home zones experiment in the early 2000s here in the UK, where a number of places were treated with this, but sometimes we seem to have forgotten some of these techniques, and particularly when it comes to new development. Next slide. And modal filters are really your friend when you're doing this kind of work. As I say, it's not so much about dedicated cycle infrastructure and dedicated routes for walking. It's more about managing the traffic and then creating. But these modal filters themselves can be a feature, an attractive feature, as you can see here. Next slide. Sorry, next one. So these are some of the features that you might look for. Is a good cycle route signage? So are you marking those routes so it's clear the route through the area? You can use them as little cycle parking areas, and obviously planting and landscaping and good quality materials. Next slide. But you can also do these on the cheap using planters. You know, some of the original ones were just made out of old pallets and so on. And there are books, you know, guides about tactical urbanism, where it shows you how to kind of do these sort of DIY projects. Next slide. One of the criticisms of the current round of sort of low traffic neighbourhoods that have been put in under the emergency powers is that they're not taking the community with them. But we have in the past done a lot of community-led initiatives, and there are skills out there, particularly from Sustrans and other organisations, where you can take residents with you. And obviously, given more time, that's exactly what you should do. And you can still then use the experimental and temporary traffic orders that to trial the scheme before putting in something more permanent. Okay, next slide. And just finally, whenever you do these things, people don't like change, and whether it's in a rural area or a suburban area or here in Waltham Forest, people don't like it, and you need councillors who have the courage to weather the storm for a few months until it all settles down. But I suspect that not many people now in Waltham Forest would want to go back to how it was. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Adrian. Now Marcus from the Canal and River Trust is going to be talking about what they're doing in the rural and suburban space to develop networks there. Marcus?
Yeah, thank you. The next slide, please. So hello, I'm Marcus Challoner. I'm the Canal and River Trust National Design Manager. I'm a chartered landscape architect, and I've been working on waterside design and waterside development for 25 years. Next slide, please. The Canal and River Trust is the charity that looks after 2,000 miles of historic waterways, and our charitable objective is to protect and conserve the environment and heritage of those waterways, and also to encourage more people to use them, because the Canal and River Trust believe that life is better by water, and our research has shown that spending time by water can make you happier and healthier. Next slide, please. Our waterway and towpath network spans and connects a range of landscapes and settlements across England and Wales. As you can see from the graphic on the right-hand side here, We have a broad church of users. Over a typical 2-week period, we might see on average 4.3 million people visiting our canals. The greatest proportion of those are people walking for leisure or for commuting, and also just sitting and relaxing, watching the world go by in the tranquil world that is canals. Obviously, we also have people using the water space for boating, canoeing, paddleboarding, and people angling, fishing on the edge of the waterway. So a variety of people enjoying a very narrow historic waterway corridor in a diverse range of uses that aren't always compatible. Next slide, please. And our towpaths are available to everyone to use. They provide accessible green and blue space on the doorsteps of very heavily populated areas where it's perhaps needed most, and also to rural and suburban communities. Over 15% of the population of England and Wales live within 1 kilometre of our waterways, and in some very lucky areas, over 70% live within 1 kilometre of a waterway, be it a canal or a river. Next slide, please. However, 61% of those households living within 1 kilometre of our canals nationally can be considered deprived when measured on the national indices of multiple deprivation. And these are the households who are likely to be suffering highest levels of health and well-being inequality. Our towpath network is flat, free to use and easily accessible, and it can offer simple interventions that promote increased levels of activity and healthier living to those who really need it most. Next slide, please. The value of local waterways was really clearly seen during the coronavirus lockdown earlier this year, when across our network, communities discovered or remembered their local waterways and enjoyed blue-green space right on their own doorsteps. The greatest increase was seen in those tight urban areas, but it was also seen right across our network. A legacy of this lockdown behaviour has been a continued increase in towpath use, as communities continue to find ways to use their local waterways on a daily basis, adopting healthier ways of living local and making local trips by waterway towpaths. Go on, next slide, please. So we don't have a towpath design standard at the Trust. We like to think about each place on its merits and consider local context of each section of waterway to inform the design, proportions and materials of any towpath improvement scheme. And when thinking about how waterways can contribute towards travel networks, it's important to understand their operational function in addition to their heritage and their character. So for instance, if we think about that waterside verge between the surface towpath and the water, it's not there by accident, it's not just redundant space, it's an important component of the towpath. This is where boats moor up, it's where anglers sit when they're fishing, and it's where you stand when you're going to feed the ducks. It's also a really important piece of connected waterside habitat, and so wherever possible, this functional verge should be retained in towpath improvement schemes, not just for aesthetic reasons, because it's got function. Next slide, please. And so, although the character of a waterway towpath or a waterside place changes from urban to suburban to rural, that important feel and function of the towpath should be retained, as it benefits all our waterway users. Have the next slide, please. And everyone who visits our canals or their local canal should feel welcome and safe. And the Canal and River Trust want to encourage all our visitors to behave considerately and to give priority to those vulnerable users of our towpaths. So we consider our towpaths to be shared spaces where pedestrians have priority. We see walking as the most equitable use of our towpaths, and walking being a great first step towards a healthier lifestyle. The Canal and River Trust have recently launched our Stay Kind campaign. Stay kind, slow down. This encourages visitors to behave in a way that allows others to stay relaxed and safe on our waterways. And we're encouraging cyclists to slow down and enjoy being by a canal. And if they are in a desperate hurry to get somewhere, then perhaps they should consider another route. And you can find out more about this campaign on the Trust website. Next slide, please. That's great. But it's not just the diverse range of users working in this very narrow towpath environment that makes our towpaths unique walking and cycling routes. It's also the historic waterway infrastructure and the waterway fabric that we believe make our waterways special and enriches the experience of travelling along them. And we really welcome the LTN 120 and the gear change documents in recognising the potential of canals, but also noticing their constraints and noticing that canals can still be considered as part of cycling and walking networks despite that, because interesting routes are important. As Adrian noted before, simply providing the infrastructure isn't enough. We have to make places that people want to travel. The Canal and River Trust continue to work with our partners to make our towpaths more accessible and inclusive wherever appropriate and possible. And where we can't do that, we'll make information available to help visitors plan their trip safely. Next slide, please. And the Trust continue to develop a strategy for towpath improvements, and we're informed by local demand and need and the potential of our towpaths to contribute to healthy travel networks. We also work hard to improve access to canals and towpaths from local communities in order to make our network as accessible and inclusive as possible, and to promote waterway use as part of a regular daily life for local communities. I guess what differs from the work Ed's doing at Sustrans, considering their network, is our waterways are pretty well fixed in their locations, and we have to find ways to utilise them and connect them to a wider network. Next slide, please. And the Trust are really keen to encourage people down to the canal, because we believe that time travelling along a canal can be joyous and should be joyous. At the Trust, we believe that life is better by water, and we believe our towpaths can be an important part of a connected, healthy transport network, and still retain the character that makes time spent on our waterways very special. Next slide, please. That's me done. Thank you.
Thank you. I noticed we've been getting some very interesting questions coming in for the question and answer session at the end. So keep those coming in, and I'll keep an eye on those. And I'd like to hand over now to Will from Solar Eye, who's going to talk about lighting and reference some case studies of how lighting is being used on walking and cycling networks.
Thanks, Andy. Next slide, please. So my name's Will Clark. I represent Solar Eye. We basically design and supply lighting products primarily for cycling infrastructure, but more concentrating on rural and semi-rural environments. We're based down in the southwest of England near Bristol, but we do export our products all over the world. Over the next 5 or 10 minutes, I just want to spend a little bit of time going through why we like cycle paths, and then really what options are there for that sort of lighting, and then some case studies where people have used our kind of products. Next slide, please. So about us, Solar Eye started within Lakeside Group. Lakeside Group are a company specialising in traffic safety products, primarily reflective materials for traffic signs, emergency service vehicles, also some reflective road studs. But over the years, it's really grown because of developing products for the market. And that really takes us to 2012, where a conversation with a local authority at Trafex, where they basically seen a reflective road stud and asked if we could develop an illuminated one, but specifically for cycle paths. And that's really where Solar Eye was born. Next slide, please. So the products that we offer, primarily our headline product is the Solar Eye 80. That's the product on the left-hand photo there. In its basics form, it's basically a solar panel with an LED and a battery pack. It charges up during the day. As soon as it gets dark at night, it illuminates. That's really where everything started for us. But again, with innovation in mind, we developed a bat hat product, which is the second product along, and I have a case study in a wee while that will explain a little bit more about that. We're in the process of launching and developing a solar bollard, and also we do have a roof light version. Now that's actually more for portable toilets, but we do actually have some options of it in some cycle storage and cycle lockers. Next slide, please. So I think we need to look at why we like cycle paths and really what options are there for them. I mean, we're all aware of excessive light pollution in the rural environment. So I think it's a question of making sure we don't have too much urban sprawl and we light sensitively and really look at what kind of options are available. Next slide, please. So I think if we look at why we light products, there are areas. There are several different reasons. They're around accessibility, safety, security, and visual appeal. Accessibility is probably the one that's really more important as things go on. There's no point building cycle paths or infrastructure that are only available during the nice summer months when people want to cycle. You'll still end up with excessive traffic use during the winter. People's rush hours are now staggered. During a local industrial park near me, the rush hour is 5 in the morning when there's a shift change. That's going to be dark most of the winter months, and probably really from now. People want to feel safe when they're cycling, and lighting helps that. That could be about knowing where the edge of the path is, knowing if there's any obstructions coming, and it also helps people feel secure. And it does help with the visual appeal of the urban, semi-urban and rural landscape. Next slide, please. So what options are there for lighting? And really, it's a question of choosing the option that's most appropriate for your situation. And next slide, please. So with regards to lighting options, I'm going to quote a document here because it kind of gives us some good guidance. It's an ILP document, an Institute of Lighting Professionals, at PLG 23, 2020. Talks about typically street lighting is reserved for urban areas or main settlement areas of high employment or education, core leisure routes and routes linking to secondary destinations. But it also says about environmental considerations. And consideration should be given to cycle tracks that pass through sensitive areas, such as sites of special scientific interest, an area that is a habitat of protected species, rural areas where the dark usage is expected to be low with a low risk, and locations where installation of street columns is detrimental based on aesthetic grounds. And I think really when you look from street lamps to doing nothing, we've kind of tried to develop products from Solari that bridge that gap, whether that be a bollard or some solar ground lighting. Next slide, please. So I'd just like to go on to some case studies. Before I go on to a specific case study, I'd just like to draw some attention to this photo on the left. This is the London Borough of Newham Greenway. It's just by the Olympic Park. And sometimes it's not a question of one option over another, and both can be used. The whole greenway has Solari down the side of it. Some of them have street lamps. And I think you can see on here where an option of two different things work quite well together. Next slide, please. So our first case study I'd like to look at, although we've actually been talking a lot about rural areas, this is actually smack bang in the centre of Worcester, but it's where the Bat Hat was born. So I'd like to use it as a little idea as to why we've developed these kind of products. Next slide, please. So the issue that was had in Worcester, that County Council identified, is you've got the cathedral on the right-hand side and the River Severn on the left. There is a colony of lesser horseshoe bats in the cathedral, and the path was originally lit by bollards. We'll go on to a photo in a minute that shows that a little bit more close up. But the bollards felt that there was it was disrupting the bat feeding patterns as they fed over the River Severn. So they decided we turn the bollards off to make a dark corridor. But the path was a really well used walking and cycling route in the centre of town, and it wasn't viable having nothing. While the site did have barriers protecting the water, it just wasn't conducive to a good environment. Next slide, please. So you can see on this one here, in fact, the bright lights in the distance, those are the bollards that were lit. You can see on that photo the bollards that aren't lit there. Obviously, this is unfortunately a photo just after Solari was installed, but imagine without those products, it was an incredibly dark area to walk. Next slide, please. So they obviously were aware of our Solari. We looked at putting it in the product. Ground lighting by its very nature illuminates up into the sky. This is very much a low level light, but we felt we wanted to do something slightly different to try and mitigate extra effects to bats. So we developed a little bat hat, we call, which is basically a black cover that goes over the top of the LED to stop upwards light spill. It's important to say there's no such thing as bat-friendly lighting. The friendly thing is to do nothing and no lighting. But it's a question of, if you've got an option of street lamps or bollards, what can you do to increase the usage of path without really having too much of an impact? Next slide, please. We've got a little video here. Before I play it, I just want to just explain what you'll be seeing. So the left-hand picture is our standard solar eye. The right hand is the bat hat version, and you'll see the little black cap on there. When you're looking at the bat hat from the side, and roughly depending on how tall you are and what you're riding, roughly from 5 meters, the bat hat looks identical to the standard solar eye. So if we can just play that video now, you'll see the difference. Next slide, please. The last thing about the Worcester site, oh, it's gone back. Go to the next slide, please. That's it, thank you. It really tested our IP68 certification. So it's right by the River Severn, beginning part of this year, pre-COVID, if we can all remember where that was. In February 2020, there was significant flooding along this site, and pretty much for the best part of 3 weeks, the site was under 6 feet of water. It obviously left a huge layer of mud afterwards that the council had to clear off. Once that was cleared off and the product was allowed to charge up again, you can see in the right-hand photo that all the products are still lit up during the hours of darkness. Next slide, please. The next case study I want to look at is just a project we actually did in Belgium. The District of East Flanders met us at an exhibition in Dublin called Velo City last year. They weren't aware of any sort of ground lighting. They predominantly use street lamps for the vast majority of their cycling infrastructure. But they had a couple of schemes that they felt they'd like to trial a product like ours for, to see if they could get some significant feedback from people. Next slide, please. So the trials basically covered 2 specific sites. The first one was a site near Kloonsbergen. It was probably about a 2 kilometre long stretch through farmland, no close power, so no idea of a powered street lamp, and it really wouldn't have been beneficial considering the location. So we've installed solar ground lights down the middle of that cycle path just to give some sort of delineation. The second site was in Rons. Now, it was along an incredibly old railway line, but they were looking to upgrade it to a cycle superhighway. In Belgian terms, that's a 3 metre wide path with street lamps. And with something like that, there was actually a survey undertaken, and there were some rare salamanders along that section. So they thought, well, there's obviously no way that street lamps can be used. The path hasn't been upgraded yet, but they felt that they wanted to do some sort of trial with a different sort of lighting. So in the site in Rons, we've actually used 20 bat hats and 20 standards so that they can be monitored for how that affects the wildlife. Also had significant tree cover. So we've looked at using an adaptation to the solar eye to have a double battery to really try and get some of the autumn sunshine into the winter. That site's been monitored on 6-monthly intervals. It's been installed about a year now. They're looking to build the highway next year, and obviously hopefully we'll look at solar eye for something like that. Next slide, please. The last thing I want to point out is not really more on a case study, but just to give some examples of where colour can be used to highlight obstacles. So this particular photos are on the Waddesdon Greenway. It's a 4 kilometre stretch between Waddesdon Manor and the train station in Aylesbury. Again, through farmland, no option really to do any form of lighting, and not a massive amount of nighttime use. But there is some nighttime use, especially in the winter months, just after it gets dark. And some of the obstacles really would have jumped out for a cyclist route specifically. So on these photos, we've actually got a red flashing solar eye, and there were steady versions and flashing of all of the products. where we've used to just highlight some of the obstacles in the middles of the path. Next slide, please. And lastly, it's just looking at, if you are going to look at some sort of ground lighting, and it's the same when you assess all sorts of lighting, is where to place them. Now, actually, there's a Sustrans document from a few years ago that refers to putting down ground lighting. It's a technical note 29, and it mentions about doing 5-metre edge spacing, but it also says the path needs to be well maintained. If you look at the left-hand photo there, again, that's the Greenway in Newham, well maintained with grass cut. If you look at the middle photo, this is actually in the north of England, and will probably be more of a rural setting. There's a huge amount of growth from brambles and nature encroaching onto the edge of the path. Doing edge lighting along a situation like that is just not going to be viable. So people will generally tend to use a central spacing, which the right-hand photo shows. That's actually a park in Froome. And really, if you're going to decide whether you do central or edge, the next thing to look at is what kind of distance will you look at spacing. Again, it really depends on the specific site. We tend to use a rule of 2, so pass the light every 2 seconds. So on that basis, if it's more of a walking path and slower speeds, we may well look at 5-metre spacing or maybe even a little bit closer. If it's a cycling path with a long straight area, then 10 metres is more than adequate for something like that. And it also affects what kind of budget you've got as well. Obviously, if you're doing central spacing at 10 metres, it's going to be significantly cheaper than edge spacing of 5. Next slide, please. And that's everything from me. Say, if you've got any questions, there are contact details. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Will. I think we'd like to invite all the panelists to join me, and we've had some very interesting questions come in, and a lot of them, so we'll try and get through as many of them as we can. If the panelists could switch their cameras on, and then I'll choose some questions for them to address. I'd like to start with one that's coming from Martin Higgett, who says that Ed said that greenfield development may be easier than retrofitting roads in some circumstances. Are there any examples where people have been able to develop new alternative routes? And has anyone got experience of building footways and cycleways behind hedges where there's no room within the highway boundary? Perhaps, Ed, you could give us your views on that, and then Adrian as well.
The example I gave was the Festival Way outside Bristol, to the west of Bristol, between Nailsea and Bristol. And there's quite a long stretch, I think it's a couple of miles, where effectively it mirrors the A370, but it's behind the hedge. So you do get, unfortunately, all the traffic noise as you cycle along it, but it's taken it entirely off. I think we had 2 fatalities in the year or 2 years before that was built on the A370 itself. So that's an example. I think the difficulty from Sustrans' point of view is that it's really back to the political will. And there's plenty of places where Sustrans has agreements with landowners in place. They're generally permissive paths rather than actual things with legal or statutory rights of way. That means that the maintenance regime may be more difficult, and also if you're trying to develop these, you may need actually instruments like CPOs, compulsory purchase, and that's obviously difficult if you haven't got the political will, because that's something reserved only for local councils to do. Hopefully that's an example and a couple of the problems.
Yeah, and I could think of a rural example in Cumbria where between Ambleside and Coniston, the council have worked with the National Trust to provide a sort of parallel path and cycle path parallel to the B road that runs between the two settlements, which is used by coaches and often congested. So it does happen occasionally. And similarly, I know there's some housing developments on the outskirts of Stafford that have provided parallel cycle routes within the housing estate that run outside of the highway boundary. So there are a few places around the country.
Thank you. Will, actually, we've had a few questions come in related to your talk, so I think I'll bundle them together, if you don't mind.
No problem.
We've got, I don't know, where have they gone? One of which is, I've heard that light pollution affects wildlife. Is there a need to change the design of lighting for cycle paths as well as for roads? And another question related to security. I find it hard to believe that solar ground lighting improves conditions for security. Is there evidence to support this?
Okay, I'll try and answer as much as I can with those ones. Yeah, as regards to wildlife, I mean, I think I said a little bit about it on the presentation. Especially when you look something like bats, which is always an emotive subject, there is no such thing as bat friendly. The bat friendly thing to do is nothing. And I think it's a question of drawing a parallel as to what you want to do to try and encourage cycling and get a happy medium that pleases all users. The site in Worcester was the prime example of how you can tweak lighting. They hadn't gone for a street lamp option there, they'd already had bollards. It was a question of then what else could be done. We've developed the bat hat to try and minimise upwards light spill, but a ground light does shine upwards. We're recording less than 1 lux at a metre. You could say that may still be too much. The next thing that we're looking at is potentially colours of light. So we're looking at developing more of a warm white light because we understand that kind of shade has a bit of a less impact on certain bats' behaviour. I'm no ecologist or know the details of any sort of nocturnal feeding. But what we do is try and work with people to develop something that has as minimal impact as it can. As regards security at night, I'm not aware of any specific areas. I think one of the schemes we've done in Bristol, in fact, was part funded by Avon and Somerset Police. They wanted to introduce some sort of lighting in a park. Solar eye was used in conjunction with some other projects to just have a look. I haven't seen any feedback from that. But I think it's clear to say if you end up with a path that's unlit in the middle of a park, providing any sort of lighting will at least provide reassurance, if not physical security.
I think I'd add to that if it encourages more people to use it, you get the natural surveillance benefit. So it's not necessarily the actual physical lighting that improves security, but the fact that it's easier to use means more people using it, which means it feels safer.
Excellent.
Thank you. I can't see Marcus, but I believe you're still with us. Are you on audio?
Yeah, I am here, Andy. Sadly, for some reason my webcam won't connect to this platform.
Okay, no worries. I've got a question for you, which I think I noticed that there's no. This has come from Sue Hilda. I noticed there's no mention of horses, the original users of towpaths. In Scotland, horses can legally use towpaths. Do you accommodate them in England?
We do accommodate them for pulling boats. Typically, they're not used as bridleways towpaths, just because the nature of our towpath network is so narrow and so constrained anyway. I think there are some examples in some sections. I think the Kent and Avon has some sections that have bridleways designated, but typically not. No, is the answer.
Thank you. And a question here from Adam Vasey related to the role of LC whips in planning urban and rural nuts. cycle networks. What does the panel think about the role of LC whips in planning better urban and rural and walking and cycling networks? And do you think that there will be an increase in funding for these urban and rural walking cycle networks? I think that's one for you, Adrian, if I may.
Yeah. So as I said in my talk, I think there is a bit of a weakness with the LC whip system, which Ed also recognised, that it focuses very much on the urban and on utility use as one of the prioritising factors, and it, there's a reasoning behind that, that the government is looking to use the LC whips as a mechanism to transfer short car journeys into walking and cycling journeys, and most of those journeys take place within the urban environment. So as a tool for planning and prioritising rural routes, it doesn't work very well. But having said that, I've been working with Derbyshire County Council and the D2N2 local enterprise partnership to write a regional LC whip for the 4 authorities that make up that partnership. And we have kind of adapted it to take into account the sort of rural and leisure cycling network, which is a big part of the economy for rural Derbyshire and rural Nottinghamshire. So it can be adapted, but as it stands in the guidance, it is very much an urban focused tool.
Thank you, Adrian. And another question for Will, if I may, from Emma Thompson. How effective is the solar I-80 when there's lots of tree coverage? My experience is solar lighting on cycle paths doesn't work very well, especially in the winter in Scotland.
Okay, I mean, solar products and solar I-80, it doesn't need direct sunlight. Is the first thing to say, but it does need light. We build in quite a big margin for error to kind of drag in some of that autumn sunshine into the winter. We've designed with Northern Europe in mind, is a key thing to say. We've all had experiences of solar lights from B&Q that you put in your garden that won't illuminate during the winter. On a full charge, which is basically 8 hours at 100,000 lux, which is a summer's day, we'll illuminate for 200 hours. 8 solid days. So we're really trying to drag in that autumn sunshine. And perversely, actually in winter, shaded areas will generally get more sunshine because there's no leaves on the trees. As regards to specifically Scotland, we've done significant sites up in Scotland, and I can get Emma some details of them. And as far as I'm aware, where we're monitoring them, they're still working on the longest night. We basically spend quite a lot of time on the 21st of December in the morning. Are they still illuminated first thing in the morning? And our oldest site is coming up to its 9th winter, and last year it was still working, no problems at all. And we've got 23,000 solar eyes in the ground, predominantly throughout Europe, although they are worldwide and don't have any major issues. But for obvious reasons, if it's really heavy tree cover, it may well be a problem.
I guess the other thing to mention, Andy, is the maintenance regime, which Will did mention in his presentation, which is in autumn, if you get the leaves falling down, then obviously they can cover the lights. And that's also slippery leaves can be a real danger to cyclists and pedestrians. So it's about good maintenance, making sure there's good maintenance, particularly at autumn times.
Absolutely. Right, here's a question I think I'd like to direct to you, Ed, first, and then perhaps Adrian could also give his views on that. It's about rural networks, and particularly it's coming from Tim Felby, and it's about rural road closures could create many miles of route at low cost. And Belgium does this very well, and they're full of e-bikes. What scope do you think there is in this country for rapid development of networks through closing rural roads?
I think there's a balance, isn't there? Because some of the rural roads that might be closed might not actually have a lot of origins or destinations or people living along them, where if they're going to be politically acceptable. So it may be that you end up with things that are better suited to leisure rather than utility cycling. It's certainly something we're looking at. In Oxfordshire, I'm told that that's just actually happened. We're looking at something similar in Bath and North East Somerset as you come down off the Mendips, of putting basically a filter right halfway between two things and diverting the national cycle network onto that. I mean, it's as we've seen in towns and cities, it's a fantastic, low-cost, quick opportunity. I think you know, if you do use the experimental or temporary traffic regulation order process, it's a way of maybe actually doing live consultation on the ground and that co-design. But I think in a lot of places, it's not necessarily going to be politically acceptable. I think it also depends where you are. I'm told that Devon has the most roads per hectare, and therefore there's probably quite a lot of roads that are very little used and may actually be quite useful for connecting the different towns. And certainly my experience of cycling in Devon is some of the roads that the NCN follows are virtually see no traffic at all. In other areas where your mesh density of the road network is much less, it's going to be much more challenging to do that.
Thank you, Ed. Do you have any observations on that, Adrian?
I'll just add to that. We are working with a developer in one rural area where the proposal is that the existing road will be closed and will become a bus and cycle only road. Within the new development, motor traffic will be accepted within that development. So I think that there are opportunities for planning gain as well as looking at existing roads where you can get pieces of highway that essentially become redundant because of new development or because of highway improvement schemes. So that's another way in which you can get these roads, and you see that quite often in the Netherlands and Belgium as well, where a new highway has gone in and the old highway is given over to the cycle route.
I think that's a really good point, and it's good to see that in gear change there's a presumption that anyone using DFT funding to build new roads will think about the cycle network as well. And I'd like to think that some of that RIS 27 billion will be thinking about how we free up some of the roads that when new roads or improved routes are put in, how that might actually free up some of the existing road network to do exactly what we're talking about.
Yeah, and we did do some work with Highways England a few years ago to get that type of scenario within their way of thinking, because they were very much focused on the red line that is within their estate, but they've now introduced procedures so that they can fund things that are away from the network that are looked after by the local authority, where that parallel route might provide for a better route than doing something within the Highways England boundary.
And it can improve their own road safety record, can't it? If they're taking people away from their boundary, they still get a measurable win.
Thank you. And now a question, well, for anybody on the panel, really, please feel to join in on this one. Land ownership is an issue for many greenways on old railway lines. How do you deal with reluctant landowners?
Carefully on a case-by-case basis. I could talk all day about this, and I think that's probably the best answer. Really is, and I think there's some very special skills that people negotiating those sorts of deals can do. One of the things we are doing in Sustrans is we're actually doing an audit of the entire land ownership of NCN. And we are identifying the areas at risk. So anything that's permissive, which is maybe a time-limited lease that we may hold with a landowner, or anything that's built on a permissive path in general, we consider to be at risk. We're looking at when and how that might be expiring, and we're trying to map all the actual bridleways and other opportunities nearby if we feel that is a high risk, particularly if the land ownership has changed and we may have a landowner who's less willing than the original landowner where that was originally put in place. So I guess it's partly by working carefully with landowners and also identifying where the risk areas are and what the alternatives might be.
Yeah, and I think that understanding their concerns, you know, could quite often you get an initial no, but then when you're kind of able to explore their concerns, I mean, there was one that I dealt with a long time ago that his concern was his cattle needed to get to water, and he'd seen a proposal where the route was going to be fenced in. And of course, you know, we'd just kind of done an outline design of fences along the route because we thought that would be what he wanted. But you know, it was just a case of understanding that he needed points at which his cattle could wander directly across the track, and once that was resolved, he was fairly happy with it, you know.
Yeah, I'd agree with that, Adrian. I think as a landowner, the Canal and River Trust need to understand what the obligations are on them, but also we just need to, I think if you're putting a proposal to the trust, it's understanding the role and responsibilities the trust had to all our users and our function. So like any landowner, understanding the context of the place and the organisation is really important before you enter any negotiations.
I think one example I've just thought of as well is where the landowner didn't want us doing it is because wherever we build new routes, we have a presumption that we will allow horses on our routes. This particular landowner was breeding horses and was concerned about the transmission of diseases if horses were allowed along there. So that's one example where we've had to say there's no horses on this route, and then the landowner was happy to go ahead.
Thank you. A question, I guess, for Adrian initially, but feel free to come on it, others as well. From Julie Milton, traders are generally frightened about high street pedestrianisation and low car changes. Is part of the problem a lack of data for each high street about where trade has been coming from in terms of cars versus foot and bike traffic, and can data from other sources, from mobile phones and the like, fill the gap?
I think yes and no. Yes, in terms of everybody overestimates how many people arrive at their shop in a car. Usually they think it's around 75%, and normally it's 25 to 30%. So they definitely overestimate car use and underestimate the number of people who walk and cycle. That isn't often enough to convince them. So you know, we've got some pop-up schemes in the town where I live at the moment, and they look quite nice. But still, people are concerned that you know, that they can't park. So data alone and evidence alone isn't always sufficient. It does need that time to bed in, and then they can see with their own eyes the impact. And the other thing I think that Leicester has experienced particularly is that some of the traders do go out of business and are replaced by different types of business. You know, so because the area changes and you know, it becomes more attractive to different types of business. So sometimes it you know, it does have a negative effect on, say it's a takeaway that does genuinely rely on sort of passing trade and car access.
Thank you. Well,
I think we've got to get better at storytelling as well, because data doesn't always convince everyone. I heard of one interesting project where they were getting students to help actually do travel surveys and ask people going into those shops that had problems as to how they'd arrived. So that's a really good way of actually personalizing that data. And that, I think, helped. But just really good storytelling, because we hear the same arguments happening over and over again, from Perth down to Cornwall. You hear the same things happening, and being able to tell good stories and really compelling kind of evidence. And this being a rural webinar, I do think we need to think about carefully about how we maybe think about how those villages, and particularly small towns, reallocate their road space so that people can still park, but not necessarily directly outside the front of the shop.
Okay, thank you everybody. I'm afraid we've run out of time now. There's been lots of interesting questions. There's a lot more we could have dealt with, and I'd just like to thank the panel for their interesting contributions, and to wrap things up there. Thank you everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.